My husband said he fucking hates our baby and wishes it was never here. When I first met my husband, I was 41 years old, and he was 53. We both had lived full lives, each with our own share of experiences, triumphs, and heartbreaks. He had 4 grown children from a previous marriage, and I had spent my life focusing on my career, never really thinking about motherhood. We met at a mutual friend's party, where he was the center of attention, regaling everyone with stories of his travels and accomplishments. I was drawn to his confidence and the way he seemed so sure of himself. He was unlike anyone I had ever met, and within a year, we were married. Our life together started off beautifully. We traveled, dined at the finest restaurants, and spent weekends at our country house, just the two of us. It felt like we were living in a bubble, untouched by the usual stresses of life. He was always attentive, always there for me, and I thought I had found my perfect partner. Then, unexpectedly, I found out I was pregnant. At 42, I never imagined it could happen, and neither did he. I remember the day I told him. We were sitting on our patio, sipping wine, and I could barely contain my excitement and fear. His reaction was a mix of surprise and happiness, though I noticed a flicker of something else, something that looked like doubt. But we pushed forward, making plans for our new life as parents. We turned the guest room into a nursery, bought all the baby essentials, and even started discussing names. It was a whirlwind of emotions, but for the most part, it felt like we were on the same page. Our son was born on a cold winter night, and everything changed. The moment I held him in my arms, I felt a love so overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. My husband was there too, holding our tiny son and smiling, but that flicker of doubt I had seen before was now more apparent. He held the baby awkwardly, as if he was afraid he might break him, and I could sense his discomfort. The first few weeks were the hardest. Our son had colic and would cry for hours on end, especially during the night. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood. My husband, who had always been my rock, was suddenly distant. He would come home from work, give me a quick kiss, and then retreat to his study, leaving me alone with the baby. When I asked him to help with simple tasks like changing diapers or feeding, he would fumble around, making excuses that he didn't know how to do it properly. I tried to be patient, showing him how to change a diaper, how to hold the baby just right, but he never seemed to get the hang of it. Each time, he would throw up his hands in frustration and say, "This is too hard. I'm just not good at it." As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel more and more isolated. My husband would get visibly annoyed when our son cried for more than a few minutes. If the crying went on too long, he would snap at me, saying things like, "Do something. Get him to stop." His impatience was palpable, and it left me feeling even more alone. I started to dread his coming home from work, knowing that his presence would bring more stress than comfort. One particularly difficult evening, our son was crying incessantly, and nothing I did seemed to help. My husband was pacing the living room, his face twisted in frustration. Finally, he turned to me and yelled, "I can't take this anymore. I hate this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, stunned, unable to respond. He stormed out of the room, leaving me to deal with our son alone. That night, after I finally got the baby to sleep, I sat in the darkened nursery, replaying his words over and over in my mind. How could he say he hated this? This was our son, our flesh and blood, the child we had created together. I knew that parenthood was challenging, but I never expected him to react this way. It made me question everything, our relationship, our future, and whether he was even capable of being a father. In the days that followed, my husband tried to apologize, but his words felt hollow. He claimed he was just tired and frustrated, that he didn't mean what he said. But the damage was done. I could no longer look at him the same way. Every time he held our son, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest, fearing that he might lose his temper again. Despite his attempts to make amends, his behavior didn't improve. He would often leave the house early in the morning, returning late at night, avoiding any involvement in our son's care. When he was home, he would sit on the couch, scrolling through his phone or watching TV, while I struggled to manage the baby on my own. I felt like a single parent, even though he was right there in the house. Then, one day, something happened that shook me to my core. I had to run a quick errand and left our son with my husband. It was only for 15 minutes, but when I returned, I found our son in his crib, crying uncontrollably, while my husband sat in the living room, completely unfazed. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "I couldn't get him to stop. I fucking hate that thing and wish it was never here." His words were like a dagger to my heart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could he speak about our baby, our innocent, helpless baby, like that? I felt a surge of anger and sadness wash over me, and in that moment, I knew something had to change. Over the next few days, I tried to distance myself emotionally from him. I still cared for him, but the love I once felt had been tainted by his harsh words and lack of support. I found myself constantly on edge, worrying about what he might say or do next. I began to make a plan, an exit strategy, just in case things didn't get better. I started researching divorce lawyers, looking into financial arrangements, and considering where I might go if I needed to leave. It was a heartbreaking process, but I felt I had no other choice. Despite his earlier outbursts, my husband began to change his behavior. He started helping more with our son, changing diapers, feeding him, and even taking him for walks. He seemed to be trying to make up for his past mistakes, but I couldn't shake the feeling of distrust. Every time he took our son out of my sight, I felt a wave of panic. I was constantly worried that he might lose his temper again or say something hurtful. I found myself checking the baby monitor obsessively, just to make sure everything was okay. One morning, I woke up later than usual and found that both my husband and son were gone. Panic set in immediately. I frantically searched the house, my heart pounding in my chest, before I realized they had gone for a walk. They returned just as I was about to call the police, and I was flooded with a mix of relief and anger. I confronted him, telling him he should have informed me before taking our son out, but he dismissed my concerns, saying I was overreacting. He insisted that he would never harm his son, that his previous comments were made out of frustration, and that I needed to trust him. But how could I trust him? How could I forget the hurtful things he had said, the way he had abandoned me when I needed him most? Even though he was now trying to be more involved, the damage had been done. I couldn't erase the memory of those sleepless nights, the fear and anxiety that had taken root in my heart. I started talking to friends and family, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some suggested that my husband might be suffering from postpartum depression, a condition that affects some men after the birth of a child. But when I brought it up to him, he dismissed it, saying he was just irritated by the constant crying. He didn't see anything wrong with his behavior, and that worried me even more. In the meantime, I continued to plan my exit. I began secretly setting aside money, preparing for the possibility that I might have to leave. It was a painful decision, but I knew I had to put my son's safety and well-being first. I didn't want him growing up in an environment where his father resented him, where his mother was constantly anxious and fearful. As the days went on, I found myself questioning everything. Was I overreacting? Was I making too much of his comments and behavior? Or was I finally seeing my husband for who he really was, a man who wasn't ready or willing to be a father? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to protect my son, no matter the cost. And so, I continued to live in a state of uncertainty, torn between my love for my husband and my need to keep my son safe. It was a lonely place to be, but I knew I had to stay strong, for myself, and for my child. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension between us only grew. My husband continued his attempts to mend the rift, but every effort he made seemed to deepen my mistrust. He was more attentive to our son, but there was an undercurrent of reluctance in his actions, a sense that he was forcing himself to go through the motions rather than embracing the role of a father. I could see it in the way he held our son, stiff and uncertain, as if he was handling something foreign and unfamiliar. One evening, after another particularly exhausting day, I decided to confront him. I couldn't continue living in this limbo, constantly questioning his commitment and fearing for our son's well-being. I needed answers, and I needed to know if there was any hope for us as a family. We sat down in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. Our son was finally asleep, giving us a rare moment of quiet. I took a deep breath and began, "I can't keep doing this. I need to know what's really going on with you. Why do you seem so disconnected? Why do you resent our son so much?" He looked at me, his face drawn with fatigue and something else, guilt, perhaps? For a moment, I thought he might finally open up, finally tell me what was eating away at him. But instead, he sighed and rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," he muttered. "I'm just tired. I didn't expect it to be this hard." I felt a surge of frustration. Of course, it's hard. Parenthood is hard. But I didn't sign up to do this alone, and that's what it feels like. I feel like I'm raising our son by myself while you're just here. He finally looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I know I haven't been the father you wanted me to be," he admitted. "I know I've said some terrible things I regret. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the father you need me to be." His words hung in the air, heavy and filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him before. It softened me, if only slightly, but it also deepened my sadness. "You can't just say you don't know how and leave it at that," I said softly. "You have to try. You have to want to be a father." He shook his head, his expression pained. "I do want to be a father. But I don't know if I can be the kind of father he needs. I'm older now, maybe too old for this. I don't have the energy I had when my other kids were young. I feel like I'm failing you both." His admission was like a punch to the gut, but it also gave me some clarity. Maybe he was right. Maybe his age was playing a bigger role in his struggles than either of us had acknowledged. But that didn't change the fact that I couldn't do this alone, and I certainly couldn't stay in a marriage where my partner didn't fully commit to our family. "I understand that this is difficult for you," I replied, my voice trembling. "But you need to understand that our son needs you, really needs you. And so do I. I can't keep going like this, wondering if you're going to walk away or say something that will break my heart again. We need to figure this out, or..." I couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If things didn't change, would have to leave. I could see the realization dawn on him, the understanding that this wasn't just about frustration or exhaustion, this was about the future of our family. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on us. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with uncertainty. "I don't want to lose you or our son. I know I need to do better. Maybe I need to talk to someone. Get some help. I don't know." It was a small step, but it was something. The first glimmer of hope I'd felt in what seemed like forever. "If you're willing to try, then I'm willing to try too," I said, feeling a cautious optimism. "But this isn't something we can fix overnight. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of work from both of us." He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a resolve in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised. "I don't want to lose my family." As we sat there, I felt a cautious sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other and build the family we had once dreamed of. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and there were no guarantees. But for the sake of our son, and for the love I once had for my husband, I was willing to try. In the days that followed, we both made a conscious effort to bridge the gap that had grown between us. My husband sought out a therapist, something I never thought he would do. He was always the type to keep his emotions locked away, convinced that he could handle anything life threw at him on his own. But this time, he admitted he needed help. It was a humbling moment for both of us, and it gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. He started coming home earlier from work, making a point to spend time with our son. At first, it was awkward. He still struggled with the basics, and I could see the frustration in his eyes when the baby wouldn't stop crying or when a diaper change went awry. But he kept at it, his determination outweighing his discomfort. I watched him closely, my heart torn between wanting to protect our son from any potential harm and wanting to support my husband in his efforts to connect with his child. One evening, about a week after our heart-to-heart conversation, I walked into the nursery and found my husband cradling our son, softly humming a lullaby. It was a rare sight, and I stood quietly at the door, not wanting to interrupt. The baby, who had been fussy all day, was finally calm, his tiny fingers clutching at my husband's shirt. There was something different in the way my husband held him, something more tender, more loving. It was as if he was finally letting go of the fear and embracing the role of a father. Later that night, as we lay in bed, he turned to me and whispered, "I'm trying, you know. I know I've messed up a lot, but I'm really trying." His voice was laced with vulnerability, and it struck a chord in me. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I see that," I replied, my voice soft. "And I appreciate it more than you know. I just need to know that you're really committed to this, to us." He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. "I am. I don't want to lose what we have, and I don't want to miss out on being a father. I know it won't be easy, but I'm here for the long haul." It was the first time in a long while that I felt like we were truly in this together. The anger and resentment I had been holding on to began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. I knew we had a long way to go, and that the road ahead would be far from smooth. But for the first time, I felt like we had a fighting chance. We began to talk more openly, sharing our fears and hopes for the future. He admitted that his outbursts stemmed from a deep-seated fear of failure, of not being the father he thought he should be. It was a fear that had plagued him for years, ever since his first marriage fell apart. He confessed that he had been terrified of repeating the same mistakes, of letting his insecurities drive a wedge between us and our son. Hearing him open up like that was both heartbreaking and reassuring. It made me realize that we were both struggling in our own ways, and that understanding each other's pain was the first step towards healing. As the weeks went by, we continued to work on our relationship, both as partners and as parents. My husband's sessions with the therapist seemed to be helping. He was more patient, more engaged, and more willing to learn. He started taking over some of the night feedings, giving me much-needed rest, and even volunteered to take our son out on his own, something he had never done before. Each small step he took brought us closer to the family we had once envisioned. I, too, had to confront my own fears. I had been so focused on protecting our son from my husband's anger that I had forgotten to support him in his efforts to change. I realized that I needed to let go of my constant vigilance and allow him the space to grow into his role as a father. It wasn't easy, there were still moments when I felt the old anxiety creeping in, but I made a conscious effort to trust him more. One night, as we were both sitting in the living room, our son asleep in his crib, my husband turned to me and said, "I want us to be a team again. I miss the way we used to be, before all of this. Do you think we can get back to that?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering the carefree days of our early marriage, the laughter, the closeness we once shared. "I think we can," I replied, my voice filled with hope. "But it's going to take time, and we both have to keep working at it. We have to rebuild the trust that's been broken." He nodded, his expression serious. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you, and I love our son. I don't want to lose either of you." It wasn't a perfect resolution, there were still challenges ahead, and I knew that we would face more tough times. But it was a start, a foundation on which we could rebuild our lives together. And as I looked at my husband, I could see the man I had fallen in love with, the man who was finally ready to be the partner and father our family needed. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. We were on the road to healing, and for that, I was deeply grateful. As the months passed, our efforts to rebuild our relationship began to bear fruit. Slowly but surely, the tension that had once defined our home gave way to a more peaceful and supportive atmosphere. My husband's relationship with our son blossomed in ways I hadn't anticipated. The man who had once seemed so distant and frustrated now spent hours playing with our little boy, delighting in his every smile and giggle. I watched as they developed a bond that, in the early days, I had feared would never form. There were still difficult moments, of course. Parenting a young child is never easy, and there were days when we both felt overwhelmed. But instead of retreating into our separate corners, we began to lean on each other more. We talked openly about our struggles, shared the load, and found ways to support one another through the rough patches. My husband's therapist had suggested that we also consider couples counseling, and though the idea initially made me hesitant, we decided to give it a try. In those sessions, we learned to communicate more effectively, to express our needs and concerns without letting anger or resentment take over. We uncovered old wounds that had never fully healed, and by addressing them together, we found new ways to strengthen our marriage. It wasn't always easy, there were times when painful truths were laid bare, and it felt like we were taking one step forward and 2 steps back. But through it all, we remained committed to each other and to our son. Our son continued to grow and thrive, and with each new milestone, we celebrated together as a family. His first words, his first steps, these were moments that we shared with joy and pride, moments that reminded us of the love and connection that had brought us together in the first place. My husband, who had once been so unsure of himself as a father, now reveled in his role. He was patient and gentle with our son, always eager to teach him new things, to show him the world through the eyes of a father who had come to cherish every moment. One evening, as we were putting our son to bed, I watched my husband read him a story. The way he held the book, the softness in his voice, the way our son gazed up at him with adoration, it was a scene that filled me with a deep sense of contentment. I realized then just how far we had come, how much we had both grown through the challenges we faced. There was still work to be done, still moments of doubt and difficulty, but we had found our footing as a family. After our son was asleep, my husband and I sat together on the porch, the night air cool and refreshing. We talked about our future, about the dreams we still held for our family, and about the life we wanted to build together. There was a quiet confidence in our voices, a sense that we had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. "I'm proud of us," I said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I'm proud of how far we've come." He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I am too," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm so grateful that we didn't give up. I'm grateful for you, and for our son. I can't imagine my life without either of you." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling a deep sense of peace and contentment. "We're in this together," I said, echoing the words we had spoken so many times before. "No matter what, we'll face it together." As we sat there, watching the stars twinkle in the sky, I knew that we had found our way back to each other. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but we had proven that we could weather them as long as we faced them side by side. Our marriage, once strained to the breaking point, had been reforged in the fires of adversity, and what we had now was something deeper, more resilient. It was a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger for it. And as I looked into the future, I felt a quiet, unshakable belief that we could face anything that came our way, as long as we had each other.